So, what is the treasure that Western civilization has ignored or overlooked? And what is the gold that is not the common gold? The great work of alchemy tells us that we have our source in the starry ground of the cosmos, and that we are literally star life and star dust in every cell of our bodies. The whole of cosmic and planetary evolution is, I think, an alchemical process when you think of it. It's a process of creation and destruction, regeneration, constant wheel, as it were, of death and rebirth going on with the cosmos itself, and then the life on the earth, and then our life as well. Because I don't think that when we die, that's the end of it. So the cosmos calls to us to be aware that we participate in its life, that everything is sacred and connected, one life, one source, and one spirit. The great work of alchemy refines the base metal of our understanding so that we, evolved from the very substance of the stars, can know ourselves as spirit. It heals the deep wound in the human soul that's come about through the sense of alienation and loneliness and separation from the divine. And it tells us who we are and why we are here. So this seminar will explore the meaning of alchemy, both in the past and for us today, approaching it through Jung's understanding of the alchemical images and the urgent need to reconnect our mind with our instinctual soul, our head with our heart, and to bring into being a more balanced culture and a worldview that serves the planet on which all our lives depend. By the way, this day is divided into 4 parts, and roughly 1 hour each, and we'll have a break, a coffee break in the middle of the morning and one in the middle of the afternoon, because it's quite dense material and you'll need your coffee break. So I think that we're living at a time now of momentous evolutionary change, which demands the breakdown of old structures and the birth of a new worldview. The scientific discoveries of the last 100 years, the thrilling expansion of our knowledge about the universe and the subatomic world, and the geological formation of the earth, and the neurophysiology of the brain, all these have completely shattered the foundation upon which our culture was built, just as the discoveries of Copernicus shattered the medieval view of reality. So we're moving, because of all these great discoveries, we're moving into a new view of ourselves and a new view of the universe, thanks to Hubble. So I think that in all these great discoveries which have been made by our scientists, it's as if the universe, through our awakening consciousness, is coming to awareness of itself through our consciousness. We are the medium through which the universe is coming to consciousness of itself on this planet. And it can look back in wonder, just as we are, at its own evolutionary history. Yet we cling to the belief that we can master and exploit the Earth's resources for the sole advantage of our species, that science can bend nature to its will, and that technological progress will bring us everything that we need. So now I come to 3 belief systems which have long governed Western civilization. The first is the belief that God created the earth and everything on it from a transcendent position, so to speak. There's no sense in our tradition, our Christian or Judaic tradition, that the divine is immanent in this created world. The divine has been transcendent, outside the created order. The second is the belief that we're a fallen, sinful species that could only be redeemed by the sacrificial death of the Son of God. Now, these 2 ideas have lasted a very long time, 2,000 years in the Christian sense, and much longer from the Judaic. So these are beliefs that we've been imprinted with for a very, very long time, that we've accepted as absolute truth, so to speak. Nobody's questioned them until very recently. The third belief, which is more recent in the last 400 years, is a scientific belief that we're the only conscious beings in a lifeless universe, one that is without consciousness, meaning, or purpose. Matter is the only reality, and our consciousness begins and ends with the physical brain. There's no transcendent purpose or meaning to our lives. And this has been imprinted very much, particularly in the last 100 years, but it's the attitude of the media and the attitude of scientific teaching in schools. And it's the general impression that one gets that in a secular culture, that's all there is. Matter is all there is, and death is the end of life, because the physical brain, when that dies, there's nothing that survives. So I think there's certain scientists, however, who, like the alchemists, are discovering or rediscovering the ancient idea that the earth and the cosmos are alive, and that there is such a thing as cosmic consciousness, and that this consciousness directs the whole evolutionary process from within itself in ways that we don't yet understand, but are beginning to look for and become aware of. So alchemy asks us to develop cosmic consciousness and to reconnect the divine spark of our consciousness with the invisible soul of the cosmos. The evolution of human life on this planet has followed a very slow gradient of ascent from unconsciousness to self-consciousness, and ultimately, in a few people, to awakened consciousness. So we're now in a kind of in-between stage between the self-consciousness that we've developed in the last 50,000 years, possibly more, and something new that's coming into being now, which is an awakening process. The whole of humanity suffers because the increase of consciousness is so slow, and the radical transformation of consciousness that's needed to diminish human suffering and ignorance is so difficult to implement. I mean, you can see the mess that's in the world today, how very difficult it is to change anything, despite what all our politicians tell us about the need for change. But it takes time, it takes centuries and centuries and centuries before there's any change of consciousness. The whole of humanity suffers. But the alchemists believed that they could assist this evolutionary process by helping to transform our consciousness from lead into gold, transforming blind unconscious drives into responses that protect and serve life. And this is their great legacy to us, a legacy that they carried for 4,000 years, which really is a tremendous privilege, I think, for me, I feel, to actually present their work to you today. So this rather horrific painting by Max Ernst describes, I think, the disturbance in the modern psyche, the disturbance that's reflected in conflicts and wars and distress, and depression, and all kinds of symptoms of disease or malaise. We live in a time when the highest value, the image of God that held society together for 2,000 years, is dying, and has been dying for about 200 years, ever since about 1750. The churches are weakened and out of touch and quarrelling with each other, or tainted by the appalling abuse of children. So there's a kind of breakdown of the structures that have supported society for a very long time. And in a secular society, there are no maps and no guides, and no obvious outer symbols or rituals that connect us to anything beyond ourselves. For many today, the worship of the rational mind has replaced the worship of God, excluding any awareness of a deeper ground of consciousness or the primordial drives which control us still. This creates a situation of great danger, a danger of our being overwhelmed and destroyed by what we've ignored and dismissed as irrelevant or unimportant. Yet, events are now pressurizing us to question all our beliefs and our habits of behavior. They really are. I mean, you can see this in a kind of world awakening process. It's as if during the last 100 years or so, we've been placed in an alchemical retort and forced to live through the fire of transformation, for the most part unconsciously, and with horrendous suffering. So the alchemist said, "Our gold is not the common gold. The gold or stone is the experience of illumination, which brings the gifts of wisdom, insight, and the power to heal human suffering." And they said there are two categories in this art, namely seeing with the eye and understanding with the heart. And this is the hidden stone, which is fitly called a gift of God. And this divine stone is the heart and tincture of gold, which the philosophers seek. So if you can just carry in your mind this two ways of knowing, this eye and understanding with the heart. And together, these make up the hidden stone. Now, the first saying of the emerald tablet of Hermes Trismegistus in Egypt is, whatever is below is like that which is above, and whatever is above is like that which is below. This is a primary concept of alchemy, which originates in Egypt, but it runs right the way through the alchemical tradition. So it's really the connection with the cosmos, this world being connected to the cosmos, and our bodies, our physical bodies, being a microcosm in miniature of the cosmos. So I'm just going to go through the major ideas or images of alchemy to begin with. So another major theme of alchemy is the marriage of the king and the queen. Now, in the ancient world, heaven and earth were always connected through the great ritual of the sacred marriage, which was celebrated every year in Sumer and in Egypt particularly. When the high priestess and the king were consummated the ritual in sexual union, and this actually symbolized the union of the invisible world of spirit with the visible world of nature, so to speak. So this idea of the sacred marriage is very ancient, at least 6,000 years old, and it goes right the way through, again, the alchemical tradition. They always kept the union of the male and female archetypes in this image of the king and the queen. So a primary theme of alchemy is the reunion of the solar and lunar dimensions of our soul, and also of two dimensions of reality, one visible and the other invisible. Is there a chair? You okay?
Yes, thank you.
Good. Welcome. So another major theme is in fact, the most important theme is the rescue of the lost or buried aspect of spirit that is hidden within nature, matter, and our own human nature. This, I say, is perhaps the most important theme of alchemy. It's the rescue of the lost or buried aspect of spirit. So the alchemist said that we should visit the interior of the earth, the dark, unexplored interior of matter and the body, and go in search of the hidden aspect of spirit that lies buried or imprisoned there. Now, I just want to tell you a dream which illustrates this particular theme. I had a dream that I was walking, this is 40 years ago or more, I was walking in a wilderness of rock or shale high above the tree line. And suddenly I heard a faint voice crying, "Help me, help me." I looked around and could see no one. Then I looked down at the ground and I saw that there was a little purse there, no bigger than that. I picked it up and looked inside, and there was a small stone. And it was from that stone that the voice was coming. "Help me, help me." So I wondered, can a stone have consciousness? And knowing nothing about modern science, I thought, why not? And I thought, how can I help you? I asked the stone. But it gave me no answer, but the urgency of its plea haunted me and really led me to Jungian psychology and to alchemy, because this was the densest aspect of matter calling out for help. So this is an example of the spirit imprisoned in matter that we have no idea is alive or conscious. So this magnificent image is a crop circle that appeared in the Netherlands last August. And I think it just speaks for itself. But one of the major themes of alchemy, of course, is transformation. And the butterfly is a lovely image of transformation. By the way, it was 500 meters square. It was colossal, the biggest one I think that's ever appeared. And nobody could have made it in a night. There just was no way that it could have been done. I think there is this longing to transform or change things in all of us. It's part of the evolutionary process itself. And so you have the chrysalis already carrying the future form of the butterfly within itself, and then the chrysalis dying and the butterfly being born out of that. I think also as I was writing this whole seminar, I was watching MasterChef for a little light relief. Are there many people here who watch MasterChef? Okay, well, there you have absolutely in front of you the image of transformation and how exciting it is, and also how quick, with 8 weeks from beginning to end. The alchemical process takes a bit longer. But if you look at, even last night I was watching a program about surgeons in India operating on the very poorest people from a train, and they travel around. And there again is transformation. They're transforming these children's lives from something totally derelict and destroyed into something incredibly wonderful. So that is transformation. When you look around, it's in everything. It's even in Gordon Ramsay's Kitchen Nightmares, which I also watch. So another theme of the great work of alchemy is transformation through death and regeneration, the kind of transformation that has to occur before a dying caterpillar is transformed into a chrysalis and then into a butterfly. Now, transformation can happen quickly, as with Gordon Ramsay, or it may demand a long period of incubation, as when an embryo is transformed into a child, or a culture is transformed into a conscious culture from an unconscious one. But for many centuries, alchemical ideas had to incubate below the surface of Western civilization because of the terrible persecution that the alchemists faced. Yet I believe that the work that they did prepared the ground for the awakening that we're experiencing now all over the world. It's something that happens in the invisible world, so to speak, that manifests in ours in time. So I want to give you this idea that in the ancient world, particularly in the Bronze Age, and in Egypt, India and China, and in many other cultures as well, the whole cosmos was imagined as a living being, an organic, living and sacred whole, often imagined as a great mother. And this world was an epiphany or showing forth of an unseen source or ground which breathed it into being, animating and sustaining it. The air itself was believed to be the link between this world and the other world, so that when you were breathing in, you breathed in that other world. So once, long ago, spirit was not outside us, we were within spirit, a complete reversal of our view of the transcendent deity. All life was spirit. Spirit was present in every aspect of the life we experienced. And it is this utterly different perspective on life that we've lost, imagining that we've outgrown this superstitious view of reality. Yet it still lives deep within our instinctual soul. Alchemy kept this alive for us for over 4,000 years. But why do we lose it? And now I'm going back into the past, and those of you who came to my seminar on the feminine, this will be territory that you've already gone over, so to speak. But for the people who haven't been at that seminar, I need to go over it because it's the absolute foundation of alchemy. So first of all, we have the Lunar Era, which is really prior to 2500 BC. Goes back in the far distant past into the Paleolithic, possibly long before that. But the moon was the most important image for those many thousands of years. The moon was the focus of consciousness, if you like, much more than the sun. And the moon and the Great Mother are the presiding archetypal images of the Lunar Era. The image of the Great Mother held nature and spirit together in her being. And this is the origin of the idea of cosmic soul that I'm going to come to later on. That was one of the great ideas of alchemy. And also the root of the idea of the great connecting web of life, which, as you know, James Lovelock has so brilliantly presented in his theory of Gaia, which changed our concept of the planet. So the important kind of consciousness at this time was shamanic consciousness, quite different from our own. And it still survives in the indigenous cultures today, and it certainly survives in India and parts of China, the parts where the people have not got on to the industrial culture, so to speak, of the modern era. And the Milky Way was very important because the Milky Way was the passageway by which souls entered or left this world. So when people looked up at the Milky Way, they imagined it as this great thoroughfare or river of light which was carrying souls into and out of the world. And it was quite a different way of knowing, what Jules and I in the Myth of the Goddess called a participatory way of knowing, which we were part of what we were observing, instinctively experiencing the union between us and what was outside us. So everything was alive with spirit. Earth and cosmos are sacred and connected, and light and dark were aspects of the totality. If you imagine the moon, you have the sequence of the phases of the moon, but the phases, the light and the dark phases, are held within the totality of the total image, so to speak. So you never had the split that you get later on. You never had the split between light and darkness, good and evil. Everything was contained within the whole. So, just to emphasize this point, just as the stars emerged each night from the darkness of the night sky, so the visible universe was born from the darkness of the dark mystery of the invisible. Everything, plants, trees, animals, birds, as well as rocks and rivers, and moon, sun and stars, was infused with divinity, because each and all were part of a living, breathing, connecting web of life, the life of the Great Mother. This is people spoke to trees, people listened to what the rock was telling them. This is something so different that we've completely lost this, and Jung commented on this very, very often. So the hidden dimension of spirit was present in every atom of the manifest world. And I'm going to show you during the course of this seminar a few paintings. This one is by Cecil Collins, who is a great friend of mine, and he has caught this sense of the unity of everything with this image. He didn't believe in the goddess, he didn't know anything about the goddess until I told him. But this was painted long, long before we even met. So, as I say, this is a beautiful image of the unity of the lunar era. Doesn't mean to say that life wasn't difficult and perilous and short, because people died probably in their 20s or 30s. It was harsh, particularly in the Paleolithic. It was very, very cold. So this is, this is the mythological theme that I'm stressing rather than the actual experience of life. So the mythic theme of lunar culture is death and regeneration. This is most important. And it's carried in the great lunar myths of the Bronze Age that have come down to us from Egypt and Mesopotamia, Anatolia and Greece. And those of you who know your mythology will know about Isis and Osiris, and how Osiris's body was cut into 14 pieces by his brother Seth and scattered all over the land of Egypt, and how Isis put the body together again by gathering these pieces. Then you have the descent of Inanna into the underworld region of Erishka girl, her sister, and how she hung on a meat hook for 3 days, that's the 3 lunar days of darkness, until she was rescued by Enki, the god of wisdom. And then she ascended, putting on her wonderful apparel, until again she was the full moon, and the moon goddess in her full glory. And then we have Ishtar, who descended into the underworld to rescue her son Tammuz, who was asleep there during the winter months. And she awakened him and then brought him back to life. And in bringing him back to life, the earth was regenerated. So these myths are deeply tied in to the earth and the earth's periodic death and regeneration. This is very important. And then we have Demeter and Persephone, who was snatched away into the underworld. And Demeter said, if you don't, to Zeus, if you don't give her back to me, I will lay waste to the earth, and that will be the end of all human beings and all life on earth. So Zeus dispatched Hermes to fetch Persephone from the underworld and brought her back for 6 months of the year to be with her mother. So these myths are very, very deeply, deeply rooted both in us and in these cultures. But they come down to us in the alchemical tradition, which I'll show you. Now this is an image of a great Egyptian myth. It's actually a solar myth because it's the sun god who descends daily into the underworld. He's swallowed by the goddess Nut, who's the night sky in the evening, and he's reborn from her vagina at dawn. And in the process of this, he encounters in the underworld a great serpent whom he has to overcome for the sun to be reborn in the morning. So here again is another myth about going into the underworld and coming up again, although it's a solar myth. So we come to, I've made a little mistake here, but I'm just going to go on. We come to the 7 themes of alchemy. First of all, the quest for a priceless treasure, then the descent into the underworld and the return, the struggle with a superhuman adversary, a serpent or a dragon or a monster of some kind. This goes all through the Greek myths as well. Then death and rebirth or regeneration, transformation, the sacred marriage, and finally the birth of the divine child. Unfortunately, I've missed out, for some reason, a slide of, I don't know if I can go back. I'm going to try and go back, but it may not work. No, it's not going to work. Oh, yes, it is. Okay. I don't know what's happened to it. There we are. I've missed out the very important image of Christ. This is at Vézelay, where Jane has just been, and one of the most important centres in France, really, for, first of all, for the worship of the Virgin and Mary Magdalene, but also for this marvellous image of the resurrected Christ. So the Christian myth of the birth, death and resurrection of Jesus carries forward this ancient lunar theme. As you know, Easter is placed nearest in the full moon nearest to the spring solstice. Is it solstice? Yes. Equinox. Yeah. Equinox, thank you. So that they've even kept the connection to the moon through this Christian story. But this theme of death and rebirth is now placed in a human context, no longer in relation to the life of the earth, but in relation to the life of humanity. This is a very important change. And the ancient idea of sacrifice is placed in a new mythic context, a new story. Elements of earlier myths are found in Christ's miraculous birth and his sacrificial death, and his descent into the underworld and his bodily resurrection. But the idea of regeneration no longer refers to the life of the earth, but to the human soul, what happens to us after our death. The resurrection of the body is symbolically the raising of matter to spirit. This is a central theme of the work of the alchemists, but in their work, this raising of matter to spirit was done here on earth, not in the afterlife. So I can pass on through that since I've done that. Now we come to the Solar Era, which begins about 2500 BC, and I think is probably associated with the discovery of writing. Because there's a movement now from the oral tradition, because there was no writing before this that we know of, to the written tradition. And the minute you begin to write, you have the development of the left hemisphere of the brain emphasized. Whereas before, whether they were more balanced or not, I don't know, but certainly there was much greater emphasis on the right hemisphere and opening to the wholeness and the unity of everything. So the important theme of this solar era, many important things, but the major theme is ascent to the light and the repudiation and fear of the darkness. The lunar myth doesn't have the fear of the darkness nearly as much, because the emphasis is on regeneration. And here we have it illustrated, really, this theme of the hero battling with the dragon of darkness or sometimes of evil. Note that the woman is connected to the dragon by a sort of lead. And I think this, in a way, I don't know what the artist really meant by it, but it does signify that woman kept this association with the deeper dimension of the psyche, probably more than man. First of all, because she wasn't educated and didn't develop the left hemisphere for a very long time. And second, because her position in society was very inferior and she was subject to man, so to speak. So she was closer, in man's view, to the dragon, which I'm going to come to in a minute. But this wonderful painting is in the National Gallery, if anybody knows about it. So this solar era is really about our separation from the matrix of nature. This is where our consciousness has emerged from. And over many millions of years, very, very slow process of emergence of consciousness from the matrix of nature and of instinct. And the separation of ourselves as subject from the world and God as object. We begin to look upon the world as something separate from ourselves and God as something up there rather than all around us. So the theme of this whole era is a movement away from nature and reaching up towards the spirit, the sun and the light, repudiating and splitting off darkness and evil and chaos. This solar phase of our evolution saw the development of the individual in all the great hero myths. That the emphasis is on the outstanding individual who's leading the tribe and discovering new things, coming right through to our own age and the scientists who are really the heroes of our time. So it's a separation of the individual from the collective life of the clan or the tribe. And of course the gradual development of what we call the conscious mind or ego. I use those two terms interchangeably. And of course God is imagined as holy male and paternal. But at the same time that all this was going on, there's a gap growing between the conscious mind and the instinct. The instinct is the foundation where everything comes out of, so to speak. And now there's this gap growing, an increasing polarization as the conscious ego draws away from the matrix out of which it has evolved and wants to keep that matrix out of sight and out of mind as much as possible. It doesn't want to look down at where it's come from or back at where it's come from. So we have the mythic theme of the whole solar era, beginning right back in the time of Sargon of Akkad in 2300 BC. You have the theme of the battle between light and darkness, and you have a great myth in Mesopotamia, which is the Enuma Elish, which is the battle of the god Tiamat against the dragoness mother, Marduk against the dragoness mother Tiamat. So that was a myth that really encapsulated this solar idea of the great battle between the hero and the dragon representing the darkness. So the result of this split within us was fragmentation, and the feminine archetype that was associated with nature and the earth is split off from the male image of spirit. It happens quite earlier on in this era. And the effect of that is that nature and earth are no longer sacred.
Can you give a date?
A date?
Yeah, an approximation.
For this whole...
This period.
I can only date the...
Separation.
I can't give a specific date because it's...
No, not specific, but sort of...
It begins around 2300 BC or even a bit earlier. That myth that I mentioned of Marduk and Tiamat is 1700 BC precisely.
Right.
That's when it started. And then you have that carrying forward into the Greek myths, which are much later. So it's a long transitional period.
Yeah.
But I would put it at the beginning of writing around 2500 BC, possibly a bit earlier.
Thank you.
Okay? Now, body is split off from mind and mind from soul during this whole long process, so to speak. Didn't happen suddenly. And to take it a bit further, spirit and nature are split apart, Head and heart, rational mind, and instinctual soul begin to become dissociated. The body begins to be despised. This is very strong in Christianity. Sexuality is regarded as sinful, and I don't know how many of you know about St. Augustine and his belief that sexuality really was the medium of transmission of original sin. So you can imagine what this did to the psyche and to the body and how it was rejected and repudiated. So the above and the below, in that alchemical sense, are disconnected, and spirit is no longer present in matter. That is to say, the living relationship between the invisible and visible dimensions of reality is ruptured. And this dissociation is the foundation of all the philosophy, theology, and science which developed in the solar era. It's the foundation of the way we think now, and the way science thinks, and the way religion thought, for certainly nearly 2,000 years or possibly more. So I hope that I've made that clear. If anybody's got any questions, would they like to put them to me now? Okay.
I'm confused about where are the churches in all this?
Well, the churches, the Christian church really developed. The first 3 centuries of Christianity were quite different from the ones after that. Everything changed in the 4th century, with St. Augustine, and an emperor called Theodosius, who made a decree which began the idea of heresy. And that's when you get the idea that some belong to the chosen, as it were, and the rest are damned and defined as heretics and killed if necessary. So I can go into that later if you wish to. Okay?
I have a question. You mentioned that the alchemists were persecuted. Was it exclusively by the church?
I was more talking then of the sort of 12th to the 17th century
okay.
in Europe. I'll come to that later on.
All right.
Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you. They certainly weren't persecuted in Egypt before this era. They were fine there.
Anne, earlier on you showed a beautiful painting of two men hewing in caves in a rock with the sun shining bright.
Yeah.
In the foreground there is the river with the new moon floating along also. That was beautiful.
Yes.
With the moon as well as the sun.
The moon as well as the sun, exactly. They always kept them together, the alchemists, in relationship. It wasn't one or the other. Okay. Right, well here is a graphic image which I've just really put in to show how this ancient solar myth gave rise to the idea of dominating nature. Because in dominating and controlling the instinct, which was so much a part of the Christian heritage, but it also existed in Greece, not in exactly the same way, but there was this idea of the supremacy of man over nature that was beginning to come into consciousness. That certainly comes into Mesopotamia, with the control of the irrigation of the land and the tremendous produce of the land that was created by this technology, which was quite amazing. And then with Greece, you have the emphasis on territorial conquest, particularly with Athens, Sparta, and the idea that Greece is supreme, really, and can master other subject peoples. But this is carried through into our own age with the idea that we can conquer nature. And even with that CERN thing in Geneva, a young scientist whom I greatly admire called Brian Cox, he said, we're going to wrest nature's secrets from her. And there's that idea. Did you see that marvelous series he did on the cosmos, Brian Cox? It's absolutely brilliant. So whereas the focus of lunar culture was on the alignment of the human community with the rhythm of the Earth's cycles and the vast living body of the cosmos, the focus of solar culture is on the conquest and mastery of an increasingly inanimate nature. The power to conquer, whether nature, territory, or tribal enemies, becomes the theme of the whole solar era. And we've had nothing but war, really, from Sargon of Akkad right the way through to the present day. So I come to the myth of the fall, which really is a metaphor which describes this painful stage of our separation or dissociation from the matrix of nature, which we had to go through in order to develop the consciousness we've got now. I think that was absolutely essential. I don't consider it, you know, in a wider sense a bad thing, but it did cause enormous suffering. And of course the matrix of nature was the Garden of Eden, out of which we've evolved. And this myth, unfortunately, the way it was literal way it was interpreted, it ratified the oppression of women, because all women were associated with Eve, who brought sin, death and suffering into the world. I went into this in great detail in the seminar on the feminine. Those of you who aren't here, that's one of the things that I did then. Because I think that this has been responsible for so much suffering, not only for women, but also for men's psyche, and the feminine aspect of a male nature, which was really ridiculed and diminished and oppressed, and no man dared to admit that he had sensitivity or feelings. Even now it's quite difficult. I have a grandson who's going through the trauma of school, the general thing of trying to be a man. So this separation aroused a profound sense of guilt and conflict, because we lost the original instinctive sense of participation in a primordial and sacred unity. And Earth, instead of being a place of wonder, really, became a place of punishment and suffering for the sin of the fall. It wasn't a nice place that we were told we were going to. It was an extremely harsh, unpleasant place where a man would have to toil for his living and women would have to give birth in pain. So it's not a very nice thing to have carrying through some 2,000 years or more of our history. But the changeover from lunar to solar culture takes thousands of years, and the greater the withdrawal from nature, the more transcendent and disengaged from nature becomes the image of the deity. So God gets further and further away up there in the sky. Throughout the solar era, this is very important, we can read the story of the human ego striving to differentiate itself from the matrix of nature and attempting to master and control that from which it had emerged. The drama of the solar quest for light and enlightenment and victory over darkness is the drama of our own quest for consciousness and our fear of falling back into the darkness of unconsciousness. So from the ego's perspective, the darkness had to be overcome for the light to prevail. They imagined the darkness as a great maw swallowing them up, like the jaws of hell, so to speak, swallowing them up. But the arduous effort to strengthen the ego split the psyche, and this split is the origin of all our problems today. Nice, tidy summary. So this is a painting by my husband. I'm going to bring one or two of them. A very beautiful image, really, of making the return. He wasn't aware. We never discuss any of this, and he's just painted these pictures totally on his own, so to speak. But as we live in the same house for the last 50 years, we have a transfer from one to the other. So this historical background is the foundation of the work of the alchemists. That's why I had to go into such detail into it. They kept alive the mythology, traditions, and the shamanic experience of the Lunar Era, because basically they were shamans. They knew that in order to reunite the solar and lunar dimensions of our being, which at the same time are the solar and lunar dimensions of spirit, they had to descend into the darkness of the underworld of the soul and rescue the aspect of spirit that was buried there. So here you have this painting of the journey into the lunar realm of the soul, very much the journey of the individual, following the path of the moon, so to speak. So now I can return to alchemy, and it was a secret art transmitted from teacher to pupil, as in the shamanic traditions. And the inscription from the pupil in this image says, "I will serve the secret of alchemy." And the one from the teacher says, "Receive the gift of God." It had to be secret, because what they taught was heresy. This is in the 16th and 17th centuries. And they were in constant risk of betrayal and torture and death. It's amazing that they could trust anybody at all, really. There's no doubt that they had remarkable dreams and visions, possibly assisted by taking hallucinogenic drugs, since they had a knowledge of herbs. I'm sure they practiced some form of meditation. And in paying close attention to these visions and dreams, they kept alive the shamanic tradition of the Lunar Era. They saw their work as connecting them to a hidden dimension of reality, engaging in dialogue with it, and being transformed by that relationship. In doing this, they believed they were creating what they called an immortal body, or body of light, in which they could live after their death. And they also believed that life had the intention and the desire to evolve, and they could assist this by working with nature, freeing their own consciousness from the dross of habits and beliefs that had impeded the unfolding of this evolutionary intention. So here we have some alchemists and a priest in dialogue in the alchemical laboratory, with the fire being fed on the right there. So alchemy has two aspects: the mixing of elements of matter in the alchemical vessel or retort, and the projection of psychic imagery onto those elements. The work of alchemists in different cultures laid the foundations for modern medicine and chemistry, biology and physics on the one hand, and psychology on the other. But it also developed the distillation of the essence of plants for the purposes of healing. This was probably a byproduct of their work. And I think that homeopathy is a direct descendant of alchemy. So much precious knowledge and insight was lost because so many transmitters of this knowledge were murdered by the religious fanaticism that has so prolonged the suffering of humanity. And we can still see today the deep suspicion of alternative therapies and the attempts to repress them still going on. And also hundreds of thousands were women, of course, who carried this herbal tradition, were murdered and burnt at the stake. So this is the background, really, to the secrecy of alchemy and to the fact that so many of the symbols that they used was a kind of coded language. They couldn't say directly exactly what they were thinking or communicating to other people. They had to codify it, rather like Morse code. So alchemy flows beneath the surface of Western civilization like a river of gold, preserving its images for us so that we might one day understand our presence on this planet better than we do. There's always been a chain of teachers, known as the Golden Chain or Catena d'Oro, who have transmitted this knowledge and insight from generation to generation over thousands of years. And there are two great streams of alchemical knowledge. One flows from Egypt, and the other from Arabia and Islamic Spain, because there were great Arab alchemists as well, and many of them moved to Spain or lived in Spain from the 9th century on. 9th to the 12th century was an extraordinary time in Spain, and Cordoba and Toledo were the centers there of the alchemical teaching. There were some 4,000 alchemists working in Europe between 1200 and 1650, and they created dozens of alchemical texts. And someone called Adam McLean, his website has taken immense trouble to put these all together, or both the images and the text, if any of you are interested. If you go to Google and just do Adam McLean, it'll come up with his website. So the images of alchemy are drawn from Jewish, Christian and Islamic sources, and also from the Gnostic tradition, which flourished in Alexandria and elsewhere until about the 4th century, when the Gnostic sects were repressed by Constantine and later by Theodosius. So alchemy is a visionary and contemplative tradition handed down from teacher to pupil, and the inscription over the far door of this sumptuous laboratory says, "While sleeping, watch. While sleeping, watch." And this next image, which I've taken from Adam McLean's website with his permission, is actually by a 16th century alchemist, but the story that goes with it belongs to the 14th century. There was an alchemist called Nicolas Flamel. He's my favorite alchemist, who lived in Paris with his wife Peronelle in the second half of the 14th century. And one night he had a dream that an angel came to him. And the angel held a book, the book of Abraham the Jew, and spoke these words to Flamel. "Look well at this book, Nicholas. At first you will understand nothing in it, but one day you will see in it that which no other man will be able to see." Not long after having this dream, a man came into Flamel's bookshop and handed out the same book that the angel had handed to him in the dream. So he bought the book, and for 21 years he studied its mysterious 21 pages in search of the fundamental secrets of nature. And he was one of the alchemists who, with his wife Paranel, actually did create the physical gold. And he created so much of it that he was able to endow all the hospitals in Paris that arose at that time and which still exist to this day. It's an amazing story. And he created his own alchemical tombstone, a huge great thing. Can't remember which church it was in. And when it was opened, many years after his death, there was no body in it. So I thought you might like that story. Now I come to Paracelsus. Paracelsus was a remarkable physician and alchemist who had a great influence on Jung and who lived in Basel. And Frobenius, who also lived there, was a famous printer. And he appealed to him for help when his doctors wanted to amputate his leg. And Paracelsus was able to heal it. But he was hounded out of Basel by the furious doctors who said, "Don't you dare come back here and ruin our work," so to speak. But he left us these words. He said, "To all of us falls one heritage, wisdom. All of us inherit it equally, but one man makes the best of his heritage and another does not. One buries it or lets it die and passes over it. Another draws profit from it, one more, one less. According to how we invest and use and administer this heritage, we obtain much or little from it. And yet it belongs to all of us, and it is in all of us." A lovely quote. Now I come to Jung. I love this picture of Jung. Now, Jung believed, when he was in Africa, Jung had the experience of really looking out over all these extraordinary, wonderful animals that were spread out on the great plain there. And he realized that if man hadn't been there to observe everything in the world and reflect on it, then all this great life in the planet would have gone on to infinity without anybody recording it. So that was a great revelation to him, really, in his trip to Africa. So that's why he said, man is indispensable for the completion of creation. He is himself the second creator of the world. And that's very important. The importance of our consciousness can't be overstressed. I think it's wonderful. So he believed that alchemy had two aims, no small aims: the rescue of the human soul and the salvation of the cosmos. That was a tall order. He came to study alchemy through two dreams that he tells about in his book, Memories, Dreams and Reflections. There are two chapters in the middle there which are fascinating. And these prompted him to collect many books on alchemy and to make a kind of inventory of all the images and descriptions that he found in them. At first he couldn't make any sense. He said, "This is total rubbish. I don't think it means anything." But as he worked on them, he began to see that there were certain themes that were emerging. And this work led him to understand that our superficial consciousness, what in his red book he calls the spirit of the times, it's a consciousness most of us use every day, has lost touch with the deeper dimension of the soul and what he called, what presented itself to him as the spirit of the depths. So I want to stress the difference between the spirit of the times and the spirit of the depths. I believe that through his understanding of alchemy, he reconnected solar and lunar consciousness for our time, and the left hemisphere of the brain with the right hemisphere. He opened up the door to the right hemisphere, if you like. He recovered the ancient shamanic way of knowing of the Lunar Era that the alchemists had kept alive through some 4,000 years. And he realized that the images of alchemy were similar to those in the dreams of his patients, and that they described a process of transformation, gradual transformation, that he called the individuation process. It's the process of transforming the soul. He concluded that the alchemists were projecting their unconscious thought processes into the matter of their retort or vessel, and that these images give us an insight, and gave the alchemists an insight, into what the unknown aspect of our nature, this aspect that's been so lost touch with, is trying to communicate. Jung understood that when the alchemists spoke of the philosophical gold, they were not referring to the common gold, but to the true gold of the spirit, which could, through repeated distillations or washings or cleansings, be freed from the dross that had accrued to it in the course of our evolution. From the alchemists, Jung took the idea of the unus mundus, the unifying cosmic ground in which both matter and psyche participate. In other words, holding us all within this room and far beyond is a ground which connects matter and psyche. And this substratum gives rise to synchronicities, as well as to miraculous healings and visionary experiences and sudden illuminations. Like, for instance, my grandson said, "What about St. Paul, Granny?" And God spoke to him and he fell on the ground and was blind. And it's that sort of thing that the underlying ground would, so to speak, arrange at the right moment. So this is a painting by Jung from his Red Book, which I'm sure you know was published last November. So Jung knew that the greatest problem facing all of us was the loss of relationship with the deeper ground or field of the soul. This painting is called Symbol of the Sacred in a Ring of Flames Floating Above the World of War and Technology. It was inspired by a dream he had in January 1914, which anticipated the outbreak of the First World War in August of that year. And it shows a figure in a meditative position, seated on a black cushion and holding a red vase or vessel above his head. It's as if this figure is mediating between the tremendous presence of spirit held in the blazing image above his head and the world of everyday life spread out before him, below him. It was after this that Jung began his dialogue with the soul, with what he called the spirit of the depths, and really took several years out of his life to go into this creating of this extraordinary relationship. He worked as the alchemists did, in total devotion to recording his visions and dialogue. In the Red Book he wrote, "The spirit of the depths pressed me to speak to my soul and to call upon it as a living and independent being, whose rediscovery means good fortune for me. I had to become aware that I had lost my soul, or rather that I had lost myself from my soul for many years. Therefore, the joy of my rediscovery was a humble one. Without the soul, there is no way out of this time." So can we just reconnect with this idea of the spirit of the depths in all of us? That we live too much in the surface of our consciousness and have lost touch with these depths. And it's quite difficult to get in touch with them again because the idea for the first place is so strange, and it takes quite a lot of work, which is certainly the work of training to be a Jungian analyst and then becoming one, and helping other people to open their awareness to this other dimension. It's important. So I'm coming near the end of this first part. Alchemy is not merely an art or science to teach metallic transmutation, so much as a true and solid science that teaches how to know the center of all things, which in the divine language is called the spirit of life. So what is this spirit? We see only the physical universe. But what about the one we can't see and have assumed doesn't exist? What about the soul or consciousness of the whole cosmos and the planet? So they said that within manifest life is a hidden reality of the highest order. And they knew that the cosmos is calling to us to become aware that we participate in its life and that everything is sacred and connected, that the cosmos has a soul and our soul is part of that greater soul, and that we can learn how to communicate with it. So in my view, alchemy threw a rainbow bridge, just as Jung did, between matter and spirit, holding the connection between the seen and the unseen, the above and the below. So the alchemist said, "Whoever shall make the hidden manifest knoweth the whole work. Whoever brings this invisible dimension into conscious awareness knows the whole work." And I think so much of what they've discovered is coming into consciousness now, at this time of humanity's awakening. And to end, I'm just going to put a list here of some, only a few, of the greatest alchemists. There are many, many more, but I couldn't get more onto the screen in one, in one lot, so to speak. So first of all, you have Hermes Trismegistus, the creator of the Emerald Tablet. Zosimus of Panopolis, I've spelt his name wrong there. Geber or Jabir, a great 8th century Muslim alchemist who lived in Baghdad and had an immense influence on the medieval alchemists in Europe later on. Then there's Roger Bacon, who lived in England in the 13th century, very well known. Albertus Magnus, who lived in Germany. Raymond Lull, who lived in Dea in Mallorca, now a famous tourist spot, but his house is still there. Nicholas Flamel and his wife, Peronelle. Basil Valentine, it was a pseudonym, I think, to disguise his true identity. And Solomon Trismosin in the 16th century, whose very beautiful paintings I'm going to show you in the next sessions. And of course, Paracelsus. And I've added Giordano Bruno, who was burned to the stake in 1600 because he wouldn't deny that God was present in nature. That was his great heresy, as it were. He wrote many books, and including, he had the idea that many planets are inhabited just as ours is. So he was one of the first people who thought of that idea. So now it's time for a coffee break. And if there are any questions, perhaps we shall ask perhaps questions before we go for coffee. If there are any. Michael?
And there was one thing slightly earlier in your talk, and maybe you covered it and I missed it. But the idea of, in the book of Genesis, of the transcendent God creating, and then that creation given over to humanity to dominate. Now, on the one hand, from what you were saying, you would expect that to be a prime type of solar myth, and yet in the same text it's got God walking about the garden, which would seem to be a symbol of immanence. I'm wondering whether you have a comment to make on that as a prime myth of our sort of
I'm glad you
heritage.
brought that up. But I think that although it's absolutely true that you would think that that was so, but it wasn't the way that it was later interpreted, certainly in Christianity. You didn't have the idea of God present in the world, and certainly within us.
No, I'm thinking
But
in
it's
terms of
interesting
when it was written.
When it was written.
What it meant to...
What it meant to the people who wrote it at that time. Well, there's so much. The Hebrew language is so incredibly rich. That's another thing, that in translation it may have lost some of the, what you're just saying really, some of that sense of the immanence within nature. But there is the idea of man dominating. That word does come in, but that may have been a mistaken translation. I just don't know. What do you think?
I wouldn't dare to make any pronouncement about it.
We need a Hebrew scholar. I know that Elohim certainly meant many rather than one God. Elohim, and included masculine and feminine, so to speak. And Ruach, being feminine, is the breath of God. So I think perhaps we'll have to leave it there. Any other questions before the break?
I'm confused by the word projection that Jung uses, that the alchemist projected the inner life or the inner process onto matter, because I'd thought that that being one, all being one, that what's happening in the retort is actually truly happening in the individual. It's not just a projection. Am I making...
Yes, no, I think you're absolutely right, and it's very difficult. I think that Jung may have put more emphasis on the projection side, possibly because that's the way he saw it at the time. He may have thought it differently later on in his life. I don't really know, but certainly the matter that they were working with had life. I mean, that's what they realized as they were working with the matter. But then they probably had the visions or dreams which showed them the matter was trying to communicate with them. So I would not agree entirely with Jung that it's projection. It's a sort of mixture, part projection and part living relationship with the reality that's in front of them. Can't put it better than that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Say they were in resonance with each other?
Yeah, I think so, yes. Or they recognized the resonance, I think. Yes, they saw that something was happening and also that their consciousness was changing as the matter in the retort changed. I think we better stop there because you must have a break, and so must I.